I'm not entirely sure it's possible to become less afraid of death, but here's an idea. And this is something I've actually written about in my book, by the way. Perhaps if you live your life to the absolute fullest, really and truly making the most of the opportunities that come your way, using your talents, saying yes to things, being honest, standing up for what you believe is right and proper, and getting thoroughly involved. Assuming you're in a position to do so, of course. Some people are unfortunately very unwell or have suffered injuries. But assuming you are able to do those things, I genuinely believe that the only way to truly confront and overcome the fear of death is to live a full and satisfying life. I genuinely think that might actually work. I've had discussions about this very topic with my father, who is getting on in years. I asked him, for example, if he could somehow be transformed back into an 18-year-old, armed with all the knowledge and experience he is now. Would he actually do it? He was somewhat ambivalent about the idea. He didn't explicitly say no, but he didn't exactly say yes either. We talked about this notion that if you've truly lived your life to the fullest extent possible, maybe that's actually good enough. I loved having children, but I don't feel as though I'd want to have more now, because in a way, I've already experienced that. Perhaps there's a predetermined number of adventures you're destined to have in your life. Let's imagine you need to get married, have children, pursue a career path, make friends, and discover something worthwhile to occupy your time with outside of your work. All of these are things covered in the future authoring program, incidentally. Maybe if you achieve all of those things, that's sufficient. You've had your life, and that's the end of it. 10 years ago, I thought if I could dramatically extend my lifespan, I absolutely would. But now, at the age of 55, I'm not so certain. I'm getting older, and I suspect you inevitably reach a natural conclusion. That's certainly how it seems, anyway. I don't want that to be anytime soon, but perhaps you exhaust yourself in your life, leaving absolutely nothing of yourself remaining. Do you ever worry that your fame confines you to the person you were in the past? Well, Elvis, after all, became something of an Elvis impersonator by the time he died. Do you worry that you've become a Jordan Peterson impersonator? Do you ever fear, in some small way, becoming the famous, suited, brilliant Jordan Peterson, so certain in the pursuit of truth, and always right? I think I worry about that more than virtually anything else. I sincerely hope I manage it better. Has fame, to some degree, when you look at yourself in the mirror in the quiet of your own mind, actually corrupted you? Undoubtedly in some respects, I think. It's a very difficult thing to avoid, because the world around you changes. People are far more inclined to do what you ask, for example. That's a potential danger, because one of the things that keeps you on the straight and narrow is people pushing back against you, ideally. This is precisely why so many celebrities spiral out of control, especially the tyrannical types who run countries. Everyone around them stops saying, "You're deviating from the path just a little bit there." They laugh at every single one of their jokes, open all their doors for them, and constantly want something from them. The red carpet is perpetually rolled out. It appears lovely, but not if the red carpet is being rolled out whilst you're actually on your way to damnation. You simply arrive there more efficiently. One of the things I've been trying to learn to manage is to surround myself with critics who will say, "Yeah, you could definitely have done that better," or "You're being a little too harsh there," or "You're alienating people unnecessarily," or "You should really have done some more background research." I think the responsibility attached to that increases commensurately with your increasing influence. It becomes a significant responsibility, indeed, even just having an off day. Here's a prime example. I've been writing columns lately about things that perturb me, such as the forthcoming famine, for instance. It's difficult to tackle these problems head-on, difficult to approach them in a serious manner, and it's genuinely frightening. It would be far easier to simply go to the cottage with my wife, go out onto the lake, and watch the sunset. So, I'm often tempted to draw on anger as a motivating energy to help me overcome my resistance to actually doing this. But that inevitably makes me harsher and more judgmental in my tone when I'm recording such things for YouTube than might be ideal. I've had debates with people about that. Some friends will say, if you're calling out the environmentalist globalists who are harassing the Dutch farmers, then a little anger is precisely what's needed. But others will say, you don't want to be too harsh because you'll alienate people who would otherwise be willing to listen to you. It's a difficult balance to get precisely right. Also, perhaps anger actually hardens your mind to the subtle, quiet beauty of the world, the quiet love that's constantly there, permeating everything. You can become deeply cynical about the world, if that's the only thing. Battle not with monsters, lest you become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. But I would simply say, bring it on. I know he's absolutely right. But if you gaze into the abyss long enough, you will ultimately see the light, not the darkness. Are you entirely sure about that? I'm betting my life on it, so yes. That's quite a wager, I must say. Well, because it might just distort your mind to the point where all you see is abyss, is the evil that exists in this world. Well, then I would confidently say that you simply haven't looked long enough. That brings us back to the flaming swords. The entire story of Christ was prefigured in that image. The story of Christ, psychologically speaking, is the radical acceptance of the worst possible tragedy imaginable. That's precisely what it signifies. That's what the crucifix signifies psychologically. Gaze upon that which you are most afraid of. But that story doesn't actually end there. In the narrative, Christ journeys through death into hell itself. So, death is simply not enough. The abyss of innocent death, is not actually sufficient to produce redemption. It has to be a completely voluntary journey to hell. Maybe that's true for absolutely everyone. There is no more terrifying notion than that, by definition. So do you gaze upon that? Who really knows? How often do you actually gaze upon death and your own mortality? How often do you consciously remind yourself that this actually ends, personally? All the time, constantly. As a deep thinker and a philosopher, it's all too easy to start philosophizing and forgetting that you might actually die today. The angel of death sits on every word. How's that then? How often do you actually consciously? All the time, every single day. Notice the angel, do you? All the time, constantly. I think it's actually one of the things that made me rather peculiar when I was in graduate school. I had the very thought of death constantly in my mind. I noticed that many of the people I deeply admired didn't really have that as an intrinsic part of their character, but it was definitely a defining part of mine. I'd wake up every single morning, and this occurred for many years, thinking, time's short, get right at it. Time's short, get right at it. There are things that need to be done. That was always there, and it still remains, and it's unbearable in some respects. Are you actually afraid of it? What would you say is your relationship with it? You know, I was actually ready to die a year ago, and I don't say that casually. I had people that I loved deeply. So no, I'm not particularly worried about me personally, but I am extremely worried about making a mistake. I actually heard Elon Musk talking about that just a couple of months ago. It was genuinely striking. Someone asked him about death, and he said, just offhand, and then continued on with the conversation. He said that it would actually be a relief. Then he simply carried on with the conversation, and I thought to myself, he's clearly got a tremendous weight on his shoulders. I'm absolutely sure part of him genuinely thinks it would be far easier if this wasn't here at all. He said it very offhand, but it was a telling moment in my estimation. So for him, that's a fundamental why live question. The sheer exhaustion of life itself. If you call it life is suffering, then it's the hardship aspect. I'm far more afraid of hell than I am of death itself. Death, you're afraid of the thing that follows afterwards. I don't know for certain if it follows, or if it's actually always here lurking. I think we're all going to find out eventually. What do you think is the connection between death and hell? I really don't know. Is there perhaps something that needs to be accomplished before you actually arrive? You're far more likely to die terribly if you live in a manner that ultimately leads you to hell. In the future authoring program, which is the particular one we've done the most research on, if people simply do this for 90 minutes badly before they actually go to university or college, it will decrease the probability of them dropping out in their first year by as much as 50%. That's absolutely amazing, and it works particularly well for those people who are the most likely to drop out in the first place. A great many psychological interventions actually help the good performers to do even better, but don't actually help the bad performers that much. Why do you think it helps them more in this instance? I think the good performers are already in possession of a bit of a vision and a plan for the future, whereas the bad performers, they're generally far more ambivalent about what they're doing. principally because they simply don't have a plan. We'll talk more in detail about why this is so incredibly important. If you don't have a genuine reason to actually do something, and then a valid reason not to do it presents itself, well, then you'll simply not do it at all. Not doing things is remarkably easy, after all. You can quite easily just sit there and not do things all day long. Doing things invariably takes a considerable amount of effort. Any sort of resistance is highly likely to push back strongly against you. Going to university or college, it's like, why is that so difficult? Well, you have to get up in the morning, attend your classes, do the assignments, do all the required reading, and write all the tests. You have to genuinely believe that this particular path is somehow better than absolutely any other path you could possibly be on. There are innumerable other potential paths available to you, and that it's better in some fundamental sense than simply doing nothing, or playing games, or being completely and utterly hedonistic. Because it's inherently difficult, there are going to be a lot of obstacles. If you don't have a really good reason, why would you actually overcome all of those obstacles? What actually happens when you do the future authoring program is two key things. Firstly, you come to construe yourself as the very sort of person who could have a really good reason, who could actually make a vision and then impose it on the world around you. How do you actually do that? Secondly, you then develop that very vision. The very first thing that the program asks you to do, and it's actually got a biblical element to it in some fundamental sense, although that wasn't actually so explicit when we first developed it, but I came to realize it later on down the line. There's a statement in the Gospels where Christ says to his followers, "Ask, and you shall receive. Knock, and the door will be opened unto you. Seek, and you will find." When you initially hear that, you might immediately think, no way, that simply cannot be that easy. Well, the reality is that it's not actually that easy at all. Let's really think about what wanting actually means. You want something, you want to find something. So naturally, you'll actually seek it out. Just how hard are you actually going to seek? Maybe you're actually after the Holy Grail itself, or the gold that's hidden in the dragon's lair, or the jewel that's hidden inside the toad's head. You're after something guarded fiercely by some truly monstrous figure. Just how committed to that are you actually going to be? There's a complete and utter commitment in that in a very fundamental way. You should also be humble enough to be open to learning, to radical transformation, to the inherent probability that you're actually wrong if you're consistently not finding what you're actually seeking. You genuinely need the willingness to sacrifice virtually everything of lesser value in pursuit of that ultimate goal. Otherwise, the simple truth is that you don't truly want it. You did not genuinely ask. You are not actually seeking. You did not truly knock on the door. This is precisely the very development of a vision. You can construe consciousness as the implementer of the vision in the broadest possible sense. What we actually confront as human beings isn't really a deterministic world that runs in a predictable manner like clockwork, where the past simply pushes forward in an algorithmic or deterministic manner. That's simply not how the world truly works. The way that the world actually works is that we confront a horizon of possibility that's inherently unpredictable. It's somewhat predictable, in the same way that a piece of music is predictable to a certain extent. It's certainly rule-governed, but not actually predictable in a completely deterministic way, and it's simply full of possibility and potential. That's actually its very nature, its inherent potential in its nature. To maximize the quality of our interaction with that particular potential, we simply have to impose a vision upon it and then actively pursue that vision. When you actually do the future authoring program, that's what you're earnestly trying to do: develop a clear vision. Here's the very first exercise. Right then, here's the actual deal. You get to have exactly what you need and exactly what you want. Maybe even better than that, you get to have precisely what you need and want, assuming that you were treating yourself with the respect you deserve. Imagine, first and foremost, that you were genuinely treating yourself with the respect you deserve, because you actually cared for yourself. What if you just don't? Well, many people simply don't, that's true. How do you actually help someone in that situation? You at least ask them to open the door to the very possibility that maybe they genuinely could. Just imagine for a moment that you actually did, not that you genuinely are, but that you possibly could, and that you actually tried. Think to yourself, right then, I'm actually a valuable person maybe. If I was genuinely treating myself like I actually had intrinsic value, like if you were treating yourself as if you were someone that you genuinely loved. You could easily imagine doing this for someone you actually cared about deeply, because most people actually care about someone other than just themselves. Do you readily identify someone you actually care about? You definitely can. Yes, I can. It simply tells you, if you're not very good at actually caring for yourself, imagine someone that you genuinely love, and then simply pretend that you're bringing that same attitude to bear on yourself, with all of your flaws and inadequacies. I'm certainly not being casual about this. It's actually hard for people to do this, because we know all of our own flaws and imperfections so deeply. It's inevitably hard for us to actually take care of ourselves properly. But just imagine that you should genuinely take care of yourself, that you certainly could, and that you actually did. Just picture that in your mind. That's at least opening up the door to the possibility, right? Then you simply say to yourself, 5 years down the road, you get to genuinely have what you truly want and genuinely need. What exactly is it? This is a profoundly deep question. Your life is inevitably going to be difficult, marked by suffering and tragedy in all sorts of different ways, by disappointment, obstacles, and betrayal, the entire panoply of human catastrophe that's absolutely 100% definitely coming your way at some point. Given that inherent reality, and given that you genuinely want to live a life free of resentment, bitterness, premature aging, and excess suffering, and that you absolutely don't want to be a burden to absolutely everyone around you, what would you actually have to genuinely make carrying that inherent weight worthwhile? That's actually a hard question. It's certainly not, how am I going to be ultimately happy? It's more, what ultimately justifies your suffering? Simply ask yourself, you get to genuinely have what you actually want if you were genuinely taking care of yourself. What exactly would it be? Write continuously for 15 minutes about what your life might actually be like 5 years down the road if you got to genuinely have precisely what you needed and wanted. Then we actually concretize it. I've personally had lots of clients and students who have actually said to me, I really don't know what to actually do with my life. What exactly should I do with my life? The very first answer to that particular question is that that's actually not a very good question to ask. You simply want a one-line answer to what you should actually do with your life. Life actually encompasses everything, and you simply want a one-line answer to absolutely everything? That's simply a bad question. You can certainly imagine a truly desirable future, but it definitely helps to actually particularize it, to make it more specific. One of the things you might want to ask is simply, where do people typically find meaning in their lives? The answer is, well, in multiple different places. Here are just some of the places that people typically find meaning. If clients came to me and they were genuinely depressed, first and foremost, I'd certainly try to find out, are you genuinely depressed, or do you simply have a truly terrible life, or perhaps some combination of those two things? You might legitimately ask, what's the actual difference between them? That's actually a genuinely good question. If you're genuinely depressed, then you genuinely have a good life, but you're currently suffering. What exactly would it mean to say that you actually have a good life? It inevitably means somewhat different things to different people, but you can definitely kind of triangulate on it to get closer to the truth. Probably, you actually have an intimate relationship, or at the very least you have the genuine prospects of having one at some point. You at least genuinely want one, and you genuinely believe that you maybe could actually have one if you don't currently have one. Probably, if you genuinely have a good life, then you'll definitely have one. You actually have some friends, real friends that you can rely upon. You actually have some family members, possibly children, if not children, then perhaps parents and siblings, or perhaps even both grandchildren. You're essentially nested safely inside a family, and your actual relationships with your family are desirable and fulfilling. You actually have a job or a good career. If it's merely a job, well then it's inherently hard, and maybe you wouldn't have explicitly picked it as a true vocation, but at least maybe you have good relationships with your actual coworkers, and you're actually doing something that's difficult, but that's actually socially productive and incredibly useful, and that ultimately generates an income for you. That's actually not nothing at all. You're educated to the appropriate level of your intellectual capability, or you actually have genuine plans to do so at some point in the future. You're actually taking care of yourself mentally and physically, and you definitely have a strategy for actually dealing with the realm of temptation and drug and alcohol abuse and sexual misbehavior, and that sort of thing. Then we've also added one more thing relatively recently, at least conceptually speaking, that you've genuinely adopted a certain level of civic responsibility, participating actively in the broader community in some way or another. If you're actually doing absolutely none of those things, then it's little wonder that you think your life is totally meaningless. Are you actually doing any of these things? No, not really. Well, that's precisely why your life currently feels so meaningless to you. Those are the primary domains of meaning, after all. If you're utterly miserable, and you actually have absolutely none of those things, the very first thing to actually do if you're a cognitive behavioral therapist working with someone in that situation is to simply say, how about we work diligently on just one of these things to begin with? You genuinely need some friends. You certainly need to get out into the dating market. You absolutely need a job, or indeed a much better job. You certainly need a proper educational plan. You currently don't actually have a life, as such. Of course, you're utterly miserable because without sustaining life, without sustaining meaning, then life is simply tragedy, and so your lot is inevitably one of pure misery. We simply ask people to go through these 8 distinct domains and simply say, right then, you can genuinely have what you actually want, but you definitely have to actually aim at it purposefully. Sin, in fact, simply means to miss the mark entirely. It actually means to miss the target altogether. That's precisely what actually takes you away from God, is to completely miss the target. What target are you referring to? You've definitely got to at least be aware that there actually is a target, and then you've actually got to try to hit it successfully. Maybe you don't even know with absolute certainty where the actual target is specifically, or perhaps your aim just simply isn't very good at all. At least you've now genuinely set up a target for yourself, and now you can actually practice hitting it properly. If you actually had an intimate relationship, what exactly would it genuinely look like? If you actually had some good friends, how exactly would you genuinely like those friendships to be conducted? If you genuinely had a job or a satisfying career, what specifically could it genuinely be? If you actually had everything that you wanted in that particular regard. If you genuinely don't know what you should actually do with your life, then you certainly don't actually know who you truly should be as a person. Sometimes you inevitably think about that specifically as what career path you should most definitely pursue. I'm not entirely convinced that it's possible to become completely free from the fear of death. However, I do have an idea to offer, and it's something I've actually explored in my book, as an aside. The proposition is this. What if you were to live your life to the absolute hilt, truly embracing every opportunity that presents itself? By fully utilizing your talents, readily accepting new experiences, being unfailingly truthful, and standing up for what you believe is right and just becoming completely engrossed in the world around you? Naturally, this assumes that you are in a position to do so. Regrettably, some individuals are coping with ill health or the lasting effects of injuries. But if you are fortunate enough to be able to act on these suggestions, I firmly believe that the most effective way to confront and conquer the fear of death is to live a life that is both complete and deeply fulfilling. I honestly believe that this approach has the potential to be genuinely effective. I've engaged in discussions on this very topic with my father, who is advancing in years. I posed a question to him, asking if he could be transformed back into an 18-year-old, while retaining all the knowledge and experience he has accumulated. Would he choose to do so? He expressed some ambivalence about the prospect. He stopped short of giving a definite no, but neither did he enthusiastically embrace the idea with a resounding yes. We contemplated the notion that if one has truly lived life to the fullest possible extent, then perhaps that in itself is enough. While I cherish my experience of having children, I don't feel a desire to have more at this stage, as I have already, in a sense, lived through that chapter. Perhaps our lives are destined to include a fixed number of adventures. Let's consider the idea that one needs to get married, raise children, pursue a career, cultivate friendships, and find a worthwhile pursuit to fill one's time outside of work. These are all elements that are addressed in the future authoring program, by the way. Maybe achieving all of these things is, in itself sufficient. You have lived your life, and that is the end of the matter. A decade ago, I would have jumped at the chance to dramatically extend my lifespan if it were possible. However, now that I'm 55, I am no longer quite so sure. As I get older, I suspect that we inevitably reach a natural conclusion. That is certainly how it appears to me, at any rate. While I hope that moment is not imminent, it is possible that one eventually exhausts oneself in life, leaving nothing more of oneself to give. Do you ever have concerns that your fame might be trapping you in the person you were in the past? After all, Elvis became a parody of himself by the end of his life. Do you worry that you are turning into a Jordan Peterson impersonator? Do you ever fear, even in a small way, becoming the caricature of the famous, suited, brilliant Jordan Peterson, the one who is so certain in his pursuit of truth and is always right? I find myself worrying about that more than almost anything else. I sincerely hope that I can navigate that situation successfully. Do you think that fame, when you are alone with your thoughts and looking at yourself critically, has corrupted you to some degree? I think there is undoubtedly some truth to that. It is a very difficult thing to avoid, as the world around you undergoes a transformation. People are far more likely to comply with your requests, for example. This poses a potential danger, because one of the things that helps keep you grounded is when people challenge you, ideally. This is precisely why so many celebrities lose their way, particularly those who are authoritarian leaders of countries. Those around them cease to point out when they are deviating from the right path. They find all their jokes hilarious, open doors for them, and are perpetually seeking favors from them. The red carpet is constantly being rolled out. This might seem appealing, but not if the red carpet is being laid out as you head towards damnation. It simply allows you to arrive there more efficiently. One of the things I have been trying to do is to surround myself with individuals who will offer constructive criticism, saying things like, "Yes, you could have handled that better," or "You are being a bit too harsh," or "You are unnecessarily alienating people," or "You really needed to do more background research." I believe that the responsibility to seek out such feedback grows in direct proportion to one's increasing influence. It becomes a weighty responsibility, indeed. Even having an off day can have significant repercussions. Here's a case in point. I have recently been writing columns on topics that trouble me, such as the impending famine, for instance. It's challenging to tackle these issues directly, to approach them in a serious manner, and it can be truly frightening. It would be much easier to simply retreat to the cottage with my wife, sit by the lake, and enjoy the sunset. Consequently, I'm often tempted to use anger as a motivating force to help me overcome my reluctance to engage with these difficult topics. However, this inevitably leads to me adopting a harsher and more judgmental tone when recording these things for YouTube than might be ideal. I've discussed this with others. Some friends will argue that if you are calling out environmentalist globalists who are harassing Dutch farmers, then a bit of anger is precisely what's needed. However, others caution against being too harsh, as it can alienate people who might otherwise be willing to listen to you. Striking the right balance is a real challenge. Furthermore, it's possible that anger can blind you to the subtle, quiet beauty of the world, to the quiet love that constantly surrounds us. Becoming deeply cynical about the world can be a real danger. He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. But to that, I'd simply say, bring it on. I recognize the truth in that statement, but I believe that if you gaze into the abyss for long enough, you will eventually see the light, not the darkness. Are you entirely sure about that? I'm willing to bet my life on it, so yes. That's quite a wager, I must say. Well, because it is possible that it could distort your mind to the point where all you see is the abyss, the evil that exists in this world. In that case, I would confidently assert that you simply haven't looked long enough. This brings us back to the image of the flaming swords. The entire story of Christ was foreshadowed in that image. The story of Christ, from a psychological perspective, is the radical acceptance of the most terrible tragedy imaginable. That is precisely what it represents. That is the psychological significance of the crucifix. To gaze upon that which you fear most. But the story doesn't conclude there. In the narrative, Christ descends through death into hell itself. So death alone is not enough. The abyss of innocent death, is not sufficient to bring about redemption. It requires a completely voluntary journey into hell. Perhaps that holds true for everyone. There is no more terrifying thought than that, by its very definition. So, do you gaze upon that? Who can say? How often do you actually contemplate death and your own mortality? How often do you consciously remind yourself that this will, in fact, come to an end personally? All the time, constantly. As a deep thinker and a philosopher, it is easy to become lost in philosophizing and forget that you could die today. The angel of death sits on every word. How's that then? How often do you actually consciously? All the time, every single day. Notice the angel, do you? All the time, constantly. I think that is one of the things that made me rather unusual when I was a graduate student. The thought of death was constantly in my mind. I noticed that many of the people I deeply admired didn't have that as an intrinsic part of their character, but it was definitely a defining part of mine. I would wake up every morning, and this went on for years, thinking, time's short, get right to it. Time's short, get right to it. There are things that need to be done. That was always there, and it remains with me still, and it can be unbearable at times. Are you actually afraid of it? What would you say is your relationship with it? You know, I was actually ready to die a year ago, and I don't say that lightly. I had people I loved deeply. So no, I'm not particularly worried about me personally, but I am extremely concerned about making a mistake. I actually heard Elon Musk talking about that just a few months ago. It was quite striking. Someone asked him about death, and he said, almost as an aside before moving on with the conversation, that it would actually be a relief. He then continued with the conversation, and I thought to myself that he clearly carries a tremendous weight on his shoulders. I am sure that part of him genuinely believes that it would be far easier if he didn't have to face all of this. He said it in a very offhand manner, but it was a revealing moment, in my view. So for him, that's a fundamental why live question. The sheer exhaustion of life itself. If you subscribe to the view that life is suffering, then it's the hardship aspect that weighs heavily. I'm far more afraid of hell than I am of death itself. With death, it's the fear of what comes afterwards. I don't know for certain if anything follows or if it is always here, lurking beneath the surface. I suppose we will all find out eventually. What do you think is the connection between death and hell? I really don't know. Is there perhaps something that needs to be accomplished before we arrive there? You're far more likely to experience a terrible death if you live a life that ultimately leads you to hell. In the future authoring program, specifically the one we have researched most extensively, if people spend just 90 minutes on it, even if they don't do it perfectly, before starting university or college, it reduces their probability of dropping out in their first year by as much as 50%. That's incredible, and it is particularly effective for those students who are most at risk of dropping out in the first place. Many psychological interventions tend to benefit the high achievers, enabling them to do even better, but they don't have much impact on those who are struggling. Why do you think it helps them more in this instance? I think the high achievers often already have a vision and a plan for the future. In contrast, the struggling students tend to be more ambivalent about what they are doing, primarily because they lack a plan. We'll delve into the reasons why this is so important in more detail later. If you don't have a genuine reason to do something, and then a valid reason to avoid it arises, you will simply not do it at all. After all, it is remarkably easy to do nothing. You can easily sit and do nothing all day long. Doing things invariably requires a considerable amount of effort. Any form of resistance is likely to push back strongly against you. When it comes to going to university or college, what makes it so difficult? Well, you have to get up early, attend classes, complete assignments, do all the necessary reading, and take exams. You need to genuinely believe that this particular path is better than any other you could possibly take. There are countless other paths available to you, and you have to believe that this one is better, in some fundamental way, than simply doing nothing, playing games, or indulging in complete hedonism. Because it is inherently challenging, there will be many obstacles. If you don't have a compelling reason, why would you overcome all of those obstacles? The Future Authoring Program achieves two key things. Firstly, it encourages you to see yourself as the kind of person who could have a good reason, who could create a vision, and then impose it on the world around you. How do you actually do that? Secondly, it guides you in developing that very vision. The first task in the program has a biblical element to it, though this wasn't explicitly intended when we first created it, but I came to realize it later. There's a passage in the Gospels where Christ tells his followers, "Ask, and you shall receive. Knock, and the door will be opened unto you. Seek, and you will find." Initially, one might think that it cannot be that simple. The reality is that it is not easy at all. Let's really think about what wanting means. You want something, you want to find something. So naturally you will seek it out. But how hard are you willing to seek? Perhaps you are searching for the Holy Grail, or the gold hidden in the dragon's lair, or the jewel inside the toad's head. You're pursuing something fiercely guarded by a monstrous figure. How committed are you going to be? It requires complete commitment. You should also be humble enough to be open to learning, to radical transformation, to the possibility that you are wrong if you are consistently not finding what you seek. You need the willingness to sacrifice anything of lesser value in pursuit of that ultimate goal. Otherwise, the truth is that you don't truly want it. You have not genuinely asked. You are not truly seeking. You have not genuinely knocked on the door. This is how a vision is developed. You can view consciousness as the mechanism for implementing that vision in the broadest sense. What we face as human beings isn't a deterministic world that operates predictably like clockwork, where the past simply propels us forward in a predetermined way. That's not how the world works. Instead, we face a horizon of possibilities that is inherently unpredictable. It is somewhat predictable, like a piece of music. It is governed by rules but not entirely predictable in a deterministic way, and it is full of possibilities and potential. That is its very nature. To improve the quality of our interaction with that potential, we have to impose a vision upon it and actively pursue that vision. When you undertake the future authoring program, that is precisely what you are trying to do, to develop a clear vision. Here's the first exercise. Right then, here is the proposition. You get exactly what you need and exactly what you want. In fact, you get precisely what you need and want, assuming you are treating yourself with the respect you deserve. Imagine that you are genuinely treating yourself with respect because you care for yourself. What if you just don't? It is true that many people don't. How do you help someone in that situation? You ask them to consider the possibility that they could. Just imagine. Another potentially helpful way to think about it is this. It's a kind of Navy SEAL ethos that Congressman Crenshaw described very well. Here are some qualities you could aspire to embody. These are my words, not his. Well, these are his. You will most certainly be someone who is never late. You will be someone who diligently takes care of his men, gets to know them properly, and puts their needs well before your own. You will be someone who absolutely does not quit in the face of adversity. You will be someone who takes charge and leads when no one else will. You will definitely be detail-oriented, remarkably vigilant, and incredibly attentive. You'll also be appropriately aggressive in your actions, but you should never lose your cool. You will inevitably have a good sense of humor, because sometimes that is genuinely all that can get you through the very darkest hours. You will diligently work hard and continue to perform well even when no one is watching you. You'll be creative and able to think outside the box, even if it gets you into trouble from time to time. You're a rebel, but never a mutineer. You are a jack of all trades, but a master of none. He follows that a little later with this. Be aggressive enough to genuinely kill the enemy, but immediately calm enough so as not to scare the little old lady. You'll be mentally tough enough to operate effectively in horrific chaos, then immediately transition to absolute tranquility, all without mentally breaking down. You will effectively transition from being a hyper-masculine aggressor to a gentle caretaker. You'll be both a warrior and a gentleman. The qualities that made SEAL leaders great were rarely physical. They listened well. They consciously empowered their team to be successful, entrusting individuals with additional responsibility. It's a conservative ethos, without a doubt. They highlighted good performance publicly and criticized bad performance privately. Those are simply lists of good virtues, and maybe not the only list of possible virtues, almost certainly not. But if you're lost and don't know where to start practicing, you talk about the idea that we are our habits. We become what we continually practice. So, If you're lost when it comes to your listening, you might think, well, you can find some things admirable, can't you? You can practice those things, minimally in your relationships, and gradually get good at them. As you get good at them, you get better at them, right? Then you can broaden out the scope of your actions. So, let's get another quote to illustrate this point. Throughout your life, this is practical advice, and wise from a therapeutic perspective. Throughout your life, you're going to have people you look up to and admire greatly. Okay, let's think about that. You look up to them, right? What does that mean? Up is something that beckons from a distance. It's like a bright light on a hill, and we assume that those we admire are people we look up to. That specifies a distance and a direction, and it's uphill all the way. It's up toward a higher vista. There are people who elicit that spirit in you. You'll have noticed, it implies that there's a sense of struggle required to get to that point, because it's easier to go downhill. Yes, definitely, that's right, I agree. It's an uphill trek, and it implies judgment because if someone's above you, they serve as a judge, or you serve as a judge in relation to them, because you compare yourself unfavorably with them. That can inspire you to tear them down. That's the story of Cain and Abel, essentially, and that's an important story to be aware of. You'll have noticed how a teacher, parent, coworker, mentor, or friend interacts with everyone, and you think, that behavior works better. They are respected, admired, and successful. And you wonder why. You do, if you're humble instead of envious, right? Otherwise, you might think, that crook, he stole his position. But if you're humble, you might think, that guy looks successful. Maybe he knows something I don't. You're noticing outward character traits that are good and worth emulating. You're noticing attributes that make individuals more successful. You're noticing what a proper hero looks like, and you're discovering a path made of desirable personality traits that helps you ascend in social hierarchies. That's Jacob's ladder. That ladder is the hierarchy to the good, and nothing less. That's the vision Jacob has of the pathway to God, that it's a hierarchical structure, with the ultimate good at the top. Then you have intermediary structures, with beings populating them. This isn't abstract. It's like when you encounter someone you admire. The reason you admire them is because they're further up in that heavenly hierarchy than you are, and your nervous system is screaming that at you. You feel compelled to listen, compelled to pay attention by your unconscious mind. You know what's interesting about identifying these heroes or role models? You can call them either. Heroes had a more compelling ring to it. What's equally interesting is the role pop culture plays. There are plenty of people who don't have decent role models. So where do they turn? Perhaps this is why it's important to engage in these cultural wars that we find ourselves in, and why they become a key part of our politics, which is necessary but unfortunate. I believe the assault on pop culture from this progressive victimhood left has peaked. I'm seeing a backlash. Take Top Gun, the recent one, possibly the highest grossing film of all time. A phenomenal film and a good watch. Why? Because it was brimming with classical virtues, touching upon relationships and how you treat others and the consequences of treating people in certain ways. These themes resonate with people. They might not be able to articulate them, but they understand them when they see them. Then you have these radical minorities, making noise, who want to see that changed. They want something else taking pride of place, but people are pushing back because it isn't true. There's no truth to it. Yes, absolutely, and something within them cries out against it. And that's something a storyteller can appeal to. I witnessed the same thing in the Marvel Avengers series. A return to classical virtues, brotherhood, a military ethos, sacrifice, striving upwards, masculine virtues, the combination of the Hulk and Iron Man. There's a monstrous element to the Hulk, but he's a hero, and he acts as the revitalizing force for Iron Man when he's on death's door. That's why those films were essential and appealing, because they are addressing a fundamental conceptual void within the culture, and it's a void that you're addressing in your book, with your appeal to duty, responsibility, and humor, right? Which is a kind of stoicism in the face of catastrophe. This is a major issue in life. Imagine you're aiming for something, and something occurs that makes it impossible, or you realize you're aiming in the wrong direction. What do you fall back on to set you straight? It's not your aim, but it could be your ability to set a new aim, and that is dependent on your character. I don't believe there's a more fundamental aim than what you should be, And there's no better way of describing what you should be than saying that you should fortify your character. So then you're heading towards the promised land. That's inspiring, and it generates positive emotion because you experience positive emotion when you observe yourself progressing towards a valued goal. No valued goal, no positive emotion. That's the way your systems are designed. On the negative side, anger and bitterness and fear are holding you back. Right, so what do you do about them? Take stock of your sinful nature. You know what temptations you're prone to, what throws you off course, and perhaps you feel guilty about it. You're aware of your weaknesses, and you likely have some sense of the kind of hell you could find yourself in if you let those weaknesses take over. So, why not just write about that for 15 minutes? Let's say this isn't what you could have in 5 years. It's the pit you could dig for yourself if you chose to just sit there, or dig. Everyone has a sense of that. For some, the temptation would be alcohol. It calmed me in social situations, it made me feel a connection to people, and it was a good stimulant, so it was a good drug for me. And I enjoyed it, perhaps too much. But I realized I had better things to do. I wouldn't have stopped without having better things to do. And that's, what did you mean by better things to do? Well, I was writing my book, Maps of Meaning, while I was still carousing about as a graduate student. I had started to get my life together to some extent by that point, but I was still something of a party animal and sociable. But I discovered that I couldn't think properly when hungover. And what's more, I couldn't handle the emotional strain of what I was dealing with intellectually. It was too much. 'Cause, when you're hungover, your emotions are more sensitive, particularly your anxiety. And the work I was doing was emotionally demanding because I was grappling with historical atrocity, and the motivations behind it were too damn dark to be dealing with while hungover. Plus, once I had written a fair bit and was editing. Once you've edited your work, you have to use finer gradations of judgment to continue improving it. If your mind is fuzzy, if you've impaired your judgment, when you edit, you can make it worse, not better. Then I also realized that the only times I really regretted my actions was when I was drinking, because it lowers your inhibitions, and that's fun. That can be fun, but I'd wake up the next day and think, yeah, I was too provocative, too aggressive, too mean-spirited in my wit, too egotistical. Or perhaps more than a little on all of those fronts. A little careless in my choice of partner, a little uncontrolled in my social behavior in places I shouldn't have been. 'Cause, I was starting to, I was a graduate student and a teacher by that point, and I was interacting with professors, so social responsibility grew. Yes, it wasn't the time to be drunk. It wasn't a good look. It might have worked in northern Alberta to some degree, in certain subcultures, but in those situations, it made me look like a fool. Well, it made me into a fool, not just look like one. When you and I got married, I didn't, and we were going to have kids, I thought, I'm not drinking when I have kids. Yes, I wanted children, absolutely. And you want to grow up at that point. Besides, I was ready to be done with all of that by then, in any case. So you can imagine the hell you could inhabit, and then the advantage to that is, people are often scared of moving forward. And no wonder, but you should be more scared of not moving forward. If you get that hell behind you, it's like, do I want to go there? I don't have the effort or the energy. I'm not sure that it's the right thing. It's like, do I want to go back there? No, definitely not. If you don't feel that hell, then you're not as motivated as you could be, because if you have any sense of how dismal and dark things could get, then, and that's right there for you. That was helpful when I did the future author thing, to think about where I would end up if I went down the wrong path. Why? Well, it's good to know how you might fall apart. Yes, and you can ask yourself, and studying historical atrocity helped me with that. It's like, do you want to be a sadist? Bitter and resentful? You want to hurt other people? Is that where you want to end up? You want to lie and deceive? 'Cause that's where you end up if you lie and deceive. You want to be resentful and bitter? 'Cause that's where you end up if you're resentful and bitter. Yeah, but people don't know what to do about it, so your program helps them make a plan. Yes, the plan is, look, we're visionaries. Human beings are visionaries. Well, I found when I did the self-authoring, the 15 minutes of writing that I did, the dreaming I did, when I wrote about my future and dreamed of what it could be like if it was what I wanted. Yeah, and then outline the goals, because you outline goals after that in the future. Those things that I had identified appeared in my life. Those yes, and that was shocking to me. Well, you look at the world through a goal-directed framework, and so when you switch your goals, what appears to you when the world switches? It's mystical in a sense, but it's understandable. It's like, if I look that way, I see the TV and the couch, and if I look this way, I see you in the chair. That's not mysterious, but I've changed the reality that manifests itself to me just by changing the direction of my orientation. We do that metaphysically as well. For example, if you decide that you're going to be courageously trusting towards people when they offer you an opportunity, even though you're skeptical and timid, but you decide, no, I'm going to have some faith in people, so I'm going to be courageous and trusting. Then when they open a door to you, that's an opportunity. You'll think, that's a door I could walk through, instead of thinking, I'm moving into a trap. It's the same reality in some sense, but the way that you're interacting with it changes. Well, it can change. It can invert. It can change so radically that it barely looks like you're living in the same world. There are potential interpretations that you can validly place on the world, and some of them are positive, and they work. Wouldn't it be lovely if you could place a positive vision on the world in a strategic manner? Not an instrumental manner, right? Because you're aiming at something good, and that would work, and that is how the world works. One of the things I loved about my clinical practice, I loved this, it was good, and I miss it. We were always working. The best parts of me and my client were working together to make everything about their lives better, and it worked. I had female clients who tripled their income in 4 years. They didn't even think that was possible. It's like, I don't make enough money. I'm barely making ends meet. Single mothers. I have no idea what to do. I don't like my job. Well, let's make a plan here. What do you want? Well, I'd like to make this much money. Why don't we double that? Just because you're going to aim at something, some people do make more money than that, so maybe it could be you. Well, is that even possible? Well, let's assume that maybe it's possible and see what you'd have to do. Well, you got to get your CV together. Well, it's full of holes. Okay, well, let's fix the holes. Okay, now you got to get a plan. Well, I'm not very good at interviews. Okay, let's practice interviewing till you're not just good at it, you're looking forward to it. I had clients who were in dire situations that all I could do was help buffer them against that, but they were a minority. I wouldn't say more than 5% of my practice fell into that category. Everyone else, it was rapid improvement on all fronts. And that's fun, and there isn't anything more practical. This is the thing too. There is nothing more practical than developing a vision. It's not some pie-in-the-sky exercise. Without a vision, you're chaotic and fragmented and hopeless and disappointed. And someone can stop you just by putting up a single obstacle. You're a house divided against itself. You have no forward movement. You're not enthusiastic, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way. And your life is a sequence of disappointments and frustrations and tragedies, and you're a leaf blowing in the wind. That is not what you're called to be. That's not what you're called to be. You're called to be a visionary constructor of the paradisal vision, really, really. That's who you are, terrible as that is to apprehend. So, what do we have to lose? We already will lose everything we have to lose, right? We're all in this game. There's whether you want it to be this way or not, you are betting everything on your life. We should make a clear distinction here, that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because awful things have happened to them. Not always, but often. So then the question is, if you're in a situation and something awful has happened to you, then why shouldn't you feel like a victim? Is there a better alternative? Part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described, of people who were in a hell in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. So they had to turn to sources of power and strength and fortitude and resilience that weren't obviously associated with the catastrophe. I mean, in your mother's case, it's a tragic situation. She's a young mother, she has young kids, now she has breast cancer, and she fights a losing battle over 5 years. That's pretty bad. Then you have to ask yourself, given that that's bad, how is it even possible that someone could handle that with grace and courage? but the kind of grace and courage that leaves their children with an immovable sense of the ability to prevail in the face of adversity. I mean, that's something. You said here, thousands have come before you, and they did just fine, so quit your complaining. It's not because you have nothing to complain about. That's not the case. It's that's not the right approach. The thing is, and this is a truly optimistic thought and a judgment of sorts, the thing is that if someone else is capable of doing something, then so are you. And that's something, isn't it? When you read about the great heroes throughout history, people who faced terrible situations and rose to the challenge, you can think, well, they were just a person, and I'm a person too, so maybe I have that potential as well, even if I'm not sure how to go about it. And much of the rest of your book, I'd say, is a guide to help people work out how they can go about it. One of the first things you highlight is to notice who you admire, and then consciously try to emulate them. We know from various perspectives that the system that creates happiness, in the founder's sense, let's say, produces that emotion in relation to seeing progress towards a goal that you value. So you can draw some conclusions from that. The first is that without a goal, you can't be happy by definition, because happiness is a signal that you're moving towards something you value. The next is that the higher the goal, the more rewarding it is to see yourself progressing towards it. And that makes you wonder, what's the highest goal then? Why not aim for that? You might conclude that you should do your best for the best. Someone might object, that's just to make me feel good in the moment. But consider this. Cocaine would do that because it actually activates this system. But what about tomorrow, or next week, or next month? The problem with hedonism as a goal is that it disappears when you're suffering. But even if that weren't the case, if you're just serving your own pleasure in a narrow sense, just thinking about me and my pleasure, it's like, which me are we talking about? Today's me, tomorrow's me, next week's, next month's. What about next year? Or 5 years from now? Or 10? If you lead a purely hedonic and dissolute life, what will you become? A burnt-out shell of a person, a dismal wreck in 10 years' time, because that's what will happen. If you don't see yourself as a community stretching across time, then you're not even serving yourself properly. But if you do see yourself as part of that community, then serving others and serving yourself become exactly the same thing. I recently ran a course on the Sermon on the Mount. In one section of that sermon, Christ tells people that they shouldn't lose their saltiness, their flavor. He says, "You are the salt of the earth, and without that salt, everything loses its flavor." Salt is a preservative, and it's a spice. People often interpret that phrase, the salt of the earth, as referring to solid, reliable people who carry all the burdens. But that's not really what it means. I looked at various translations and spoke to lots of people about that verse. What it really means is that there should be some spiciness, some unpredictability, and some humor. Here we have lists of virtues. They might not be the only possible list, and probably aren't. But if you feel lost and unsure of where to start, as a way of practicing, you discuss this idea too, an Aristotelian one, of course, that we are, in fact, our habits. We become the things we practice. So, imagine feeling lost while listening and thinking, I find some things admirable. Well, why not put those things into practice? You can start small, locally, within your own relationships, and slowly but surely develop a knack for them. As you get better, your proficiency will grow, wouldn't you say? And from there, you can broaden the scope of your actions to take in a wider perspective. As you've said yourself, and to quote you again here, throughout your life, this being eminently practical advice, I might add, and wise from a therapeutic point of view. Throughout your life, you have people whom you look up to. Right, let's think about that for a moment. You look up. What does that really mean? Why up? Well, up suggests something beckoning us from afar, like a beacon on a distant hill. We naturally assume that people we admire are people we look up to, and that implies both a distance and a direction, which is usually uphill. Up towards a higher vantage point, if you will. So, naturally, there are people who inspire that feeling in us. You've probably noticed. And the way it also implies. Yes, it probably implies that some degree of struggle is needed to reach that point, because it's so much easier to go down than to go up. Yes, absolutely, you're spot on there. It's an uphill climb, and it also suggests a certain judgment, as if someone is above you, then they act as a judge, or perhaps you act as a judge in relation to them, as you compare yourself unfavorably. But this can also inspire you to try and pull them down. That, in essence, is the story of Cain and Abel, a story of immense significance. You've seen how a teacher, a parent, a colleague, a mentor, or even a friend interacts with others, and you think, that behavior is simply more effective. They are respected, admired, and successful. And you wonder why that is. You do, if you possess a little humility, rather than envy, no? Otherwise, you might just think, that wretched crook just stole his position. That's how he got there. But a touch of humility would lead you to think, no, that person seems successful, perhaps he knows something that I don't. You become aware of outward traits that are praiseworthy and worth copying. You see the attributes that make some people more successful than others. You begin to recognize what a hero looks like, and in doing so, you discover a path paved with desirable personality traits, one that helps you climb the social ladder. This, by the way, is Jacob's ladder. That ladder represents the hierarchy to all that is good, the vision that Jacob had of the pathway to God as a hierarchical structure culminating in that which is ultimately good at the top, by definition. The best of all possible good things, with structures in between leading all the way up, filled with beings. And this isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. It's like when you meet someone you admire. The reason you admire them is because they're further up that ladder to greatness than you are. And your whole nervous system is telling you exactly that. You feel you must listen, must pay attention, driven by the very way your unconscious mind works. It's fascinating how popular culture plays a crucial role in helping us identify these heroes or role models. The terms are almost interchangeable, though I prefer hero because it sounds more literary. After all, many people simply don't have good role models in their own lives, and we need to recognize that. So where do they turn? Perhaps this is why it's so important that we fight these cultural battles, the kind that you and I often find ourselves in. They're a vital, but also deeply unfortunate, part of our politics. I think the attack on popular culture from the progressive left, with their focus on victimhood, has reached its peak. There's a strong reaction against it. Take a film like the recent Top Gun, possibly the biggest box office hit of all time. A truly amazing piece of cinema, and hugely enjoyable. Why? Because it embodies all those classic virtues, relationships, how you treat other people, and the consequences of treating people badly. These things really resonate with people on a deep level. They might not always be able to put it into words, but they instinctively understand it. There's a small but vocal group who want to change this, who want to put something else in its place. But the people are pushing back, because it's simply not true. There's no truth in it at all. Exactly, and something inside us cries out against it. A skilled storyteller can then tap into this. I saw the same thing with the Marvel Avengers series, a return to a whole range of classic virtues. Brotherhood, a kind of military spirit, sacrifice, striving to be better, and definitely masculine virtues. The pairing of the Hulk and Iron Man, for example. The Hulk, even though he's a monster, is a hero in his own way, and he also helps to revive Iron Man when he's close to death. That's why these movies were so necessary and popular, because they fill a huge, conceptual gap in our culture, a gap that you're addressing in your book, through your focus on duty, responsibility, and humor, all at the same time. A kind of stoicism in the face of disaster. Because this is a big challenge in life. Imagine aiming for something, only for something to happen that makes it impossible, or realizing that you're wrong and aiming in the wrong direction. What can you rely on to put you back on course? Not your original aim, obviously, but maybe your ability to set a new one. And this completely depends on your character. So I'd argue that there's no aim more important than what you should be, and no better way to define this than to say that you should strengthen your character. Then you're, in a way, moving towards the promised land. This is inspiring, and it makes you feel good, because we feel this when we see ourselves getting closer to something we really want. Take away the goal, and you take away all the good feelings. That's how our systems are wired, psychologically and physically. On the other hand, anger, bitterness, and fear stop you in your tracks. So what do we do with them? Take a good look at your sinful nature. Know what tempts you, those things that can throw you off course, and which might make you feel guilty. Acknowledge your weaknesses, And think about the hell you might end up in if you let those weaknesses get the better of you. Then spend 15 minutes writing about that very thing. Not what you could have in 5 years' time, but the hole that you could dig for yourself if you just decided to sit there or keep digging. Everyone understands this on some level. For some, the temptation might be alcohol. It helped me to feel calm in social situations, gave me a sense of connection, and was a pretty good stimulant. It was for me a very effective drug, and one that I enjoyed maybe a bit too much. But I realized I had much better things to do. I would never have stopped without those better things to do. What do I mean by that? Well, I was writing maps of meaning while still living it up as a graduate student. I had started to sort my life out to some extent, but was still a party animal and very sociable. But I realized that I couldn't think clearly when I was hungover. What's more, I couldn't handle the emotional stress of what I was dealing with intellectually. It was all too much, because when you're hungover, your emotions are heightened, especially anxiety. And the work I was doing was far too emotionally demanding, as it was about historical atrocities and the reasons behind them. It was all too dark to deal with while hungover. Besides, by the time I had written a lot of it and was editing, I realized that you need ever finer degrees of judgment to improve your work. And if your judgment is impaired, you risk making things worse, not better. The only times that I really regretted my actions was when I had been drinking, because it lowers your inhibitions. And this can be fun, but I would wake up the next day and think, I was a bit too provocative, a bit too aggressive. My wit was a bit too cutting, and I was far too egotistical. A little more than a little, in fact, on all of those counts. A little careless in my choice of partner, and a little uncontrolled in my social behavior, in places I shouldn't have been. I was starting to. Well, I was a graduate student and a teacher by that point. I was interacting with professors, and my social responsibilities were increasing. It wasn't a time to be drunk. It just wasn't suitable. It might have worked in northern Alberta, to some extent, within certain subcultures, but in this context it just made me look like a fool. Well, it made me into a fool, not just give the impression of one. And then, when you and I got married, when we were planning to have children, I decided to stop drinking altogether. I wanted children, and I knew that I needed to grow up. Besides, I was ready to be done with all of that anyway. So imagine the hell you might end up in. The good thing is that while people are often afraid of moving forward, you should be far more afraid of standing still. Once you've left that hell behind, you realize you have no desire to go back. It takes too much effort, too much energy. You're not even sure it's the right path. Do you want to go back there? Absolutely not. And without the feeling of that hell, you won't be motivated in the same way. Having a real sense of the darkness that awaits you is a powerful motivator. And that's exactly what it's there for. The future authoring exercise really helped with that. It made me think about where I might end up if I took the wrong path. Why? Because it helps you to understand how you might fall apart. You can ask yourself questions. Studying historical atrocities helped me too. Do you want to become a sadist? Bitter and resentful? To hurt other people? Is that what you really want? Do you want to lie and deceive? Because that's where you'll end up. If you become resentful and bitter, that will be your fate. Yes, but sometimes people just don't know what to do about it, so your program helps them come up with a plan. The plan is simple. We are all visionaries. Human beings are, at their core, visionaries. Self-authoring, in particular, helped me with this. The 15 minutes of writing, the dreaming that I did, when I wrote about my future and dared to dream of how things might be if I could create it exactly as I wanted. And then, when I set out my goals, because that comes next in the authoring process, all of the things that I had identified started to happen in my life. It was quite amazing, to say the least. The thing is, we see the world through the lens of our goals. When we change those goals, what we see in the world around us also changes. It's a bit mystical in some ways, but in another sense, perfectly understandable. If I look in one direction, I see the TV and the sofa. If I look in the other, I see you in the chair. Nothing particularly mysterious. But I've changed the reality that I'm seeing just by changing the direction I'm looking in. We do this in a deeper way, too. For example, if you decide to be bravely trusting towards people who offer you an opportunity, even though you're naturally cautious and a bit scared, you're more likely to see the open door as an opportunity to go through, rather than a trap. It's the same reality, but the way we interact with it is what changes. It can change things so much that you feel like you hardly recognize the world you're living in. The world can be understood in many different ways, and some of these are really positive and effective. Imagine if you could deliberately and strategically create a really positive vision of the world, aiming for something genuinely good. That's exactly how the world works. One of the things I loved about my clinical practice, and I really miss this, was working with my clients to improve every part of their lives. And it worked. Many of my female clients tripled their incomes within 4 years, something that they had never thought possible. I don't earn enough money. I can barely make ends meet. I'm a single mom, I don't know what to do, and I hate my job. Let's make a plan. What do you want? I want to earn this much money. Well, why don't we double that? Aiming higher has its advantages. Some people do earn more than that, so maybe that could be you. But that's impossible. Let's pretend, for now, that it is possible, and then work out what you need to do. I need to get my CV sorted out, but it's full of gaps. Right, let's fill those gaps. Now you need a plan. But I'm terrible at interviews. Then we'll practice interviewing until you don't just scrape by, but actually look forward to it. I had some clients who were in such difficult situations that the best I could do was to support them. But they were in the minority, no more. There needs to be some flexibility in the system, a bit of wiggle room, because that's what stops you from just blindly following the rules, without any real understanding or feeling. There should be a bit of temptation, a bit of passion. These are all ways of saying that there needs to be some energy within you. A lot of that energy comes from enthusiasm, which is enjoyable. But enthusiasm literally means to be filled with the Spirit of God. That's also why people enjoy comedians so much. That's what comedians do. So, you have to balance duty with humor. And your book does this brilliantly, because it's a deeply conservative book in the best sense, a call to duty and responsibility. But you always come back to themes of both Stoicism and humor, which are linked. I was recently in Newfoundland for a week, filming a documentary. Newfoundland is a rugged, beautiful, and tough place, and the people there are strong and resilient. They have to be. Newfoundlanders have a great sense of humor, always joking around, and that's a necessary lightness. That ability to deal with serious things in a light-hearted way. It's something I'm trying to learn more and more, even in the most serious conversations. You know, if you're really good at it, you have both. That light touch and that sense of humor. You see it a lot in military people who have been through difficult things. When you see someone in real suffering, what you should try to do is offer them a lifeline. One possible lifeline is compassion, and that's probably the right thing to offer a baby who's upset, overwhelming compassion. But for someone who is an adult, or becoming an adult, the lifeline might be to show them the potential they have to be more than they are now. Enough more that they could actually cope with the suffering. So it doesn't turn into a complete disaster and pull everything down with it. And there's nothing more optimistic than that. You say something in your book that I think is really important. Let me read it. It is true that character is to some extent innate. I'd say that what it does is give each of us a range of talents and a range of temptations. Something like that. It's the hand we're dealt, and there's definitely a genetic element to it. Our genes make us more likely to do certain things. But it's also true that character is mostly the result of choices. We all make them, oddly enough, and we should make them deliberately, understanding that these choices are part of our responsibility to a purpose beyond our own selfish desires. That responsibility extends to your family, friends, community, and country. This is something that conservatives suggest as a way to become virtuous. What's so interesting about that, as far as I'm concerned, as a way to deal with overly individualistic liberalism, is that I've seen, as a clinical psychologist, that when people are really struggling, the ability to help others, your family, your friends, your community, your country, is actually a saving grace. People really find deep and lasting meaning in that. So, it's not just about telling people what they should do and pointing out their duty. It's that if you're in a bad way, if your life is falling apart, if you're feeling lost and miserable, and maybe you have good reasons to be, it's still true that if you look beyond yourself and try to make the lives of others better, that's the best thing you can do for yourself. Imagine that there's a dragon coming, a real threat. Someone comes along and says, "There's a dragon, and I'm the person to deal with it." That's what environmentalists say, the radical ones who push the limits of growth. And I look at them and think, okay, is that dragon real or not? That's one question. I ask myself that question every time I spend time alone. Is an apocalypse about to happen because of the environment, yes or no? I'll just leave that aside for now. I think you can argue it either way, for different reasons. It's not something to ignore. We've overfished the oceans badly, and there are big environmental problems. Whether climate change is the biggest one is another question, but we won't get into that. The point is, you're saying you can deal with this dragon. Why should I listen to you? Well, let's see how you're reacting to the dragon. First of all, you're terrified and in a state of panic. That might suggest you're not the right person for the job. Secondly, you're willing to use force to make other people fight the dragon for you. So now, not only are you scared, but you're a scared tyrant. In that case, I'd say you're not the Moses we need to lead us out of this crisis. Maybe there's a neurological explanation. If you're so afraid of what you're facing that you're paralyzed by panic and despair, and you're willing to use tyrannical force to get your way, you're not the right leader for the time. That's why I admire people like Bjorn Lomborg, Matt Ridley, and Marian Tupy. They say, look, we have environmental problems, and you could argue that there's a Malthusian element in some situations. But basically, humans have always been able to learn very quickly and faster all the time, to do more with less. And we've got this. I agree with that idea. I think about it in a basic way. I have faith in the insights of Lomborg, Tupy, and Matt Ridley. They've clearly given these matters considerable thought. They aren't simply dismissing environmental concerns, whatever the environment even encompasses. I'm not even sure what people mean by it. It's everything, isn't it? The environment that I'm supposed to be worried about. How does that differ from saying I'm worried about absolutely everything? Are those statements even distinguishable in meaning? How do women select their partners? Unlike female chimpanzees, human females are decidedly choosy. Female chimps, when they're in estrus, will copulate with any available male. The dominant males are more likely to mate with them, granted, but that's primarily because they drive away the weaker males, not because the females are exercising any real choice. Human females, however, do make a conscious choice, and that's just one of the many things that sets us apart from chimpanzees. But how do they go about it? Well, they observe the male hierarchy, where the men are perpetually competing with one another. You could argue that they're competing for power, but that's rather a cynical way of viewing it. Let's say they're competing for influence, for leadership roles. In a sense, the men at the apex of the hierarchy, if they're decent men, are actually chosen by the other men. I'm aware that there are bullies and predators and all that, but I'm speaking generally, over a longer period of time. The men organize themselves, and influential men naturally rise to the top, and then the women select them. Think about the implications of that. For millions of years, a hierarchy of that nature has existed. Let's say that's been the case since we diverged from chimpanzees, roughly 6 million years ago. That implies that the male hierarchy is the driving force that propels the mating male to the summit. So, the male who is most likely to flourish within the hierarchy is also the one most likely to pass on his genetic material. Therefore, the male hierarchy serves as a mechanism for selecting males, a mechanism that is ultimately controlled by the female. What that signifies is that as we've evolved over those 6 million years, men have become increasingly well adapted not only to the hierarchy itself, but also to possessing the wherewithal to ascend it. That's the core essence, you might say. That's the essence of the individual, the inherent drive to climb hierarchies. It's the all-seeing eye at the top of the pyramid, and it's a trait that has been specifically selected for. We become increasingly adept, for biological reasons that are also influenced by culture, at figuring out how to navigate various hierarchies so that we can successfully pass on our genes. That's essentially what has shaped human beings. Now, imagine that process has been unfolding for 6 million years. Then imagine that we began to take notice of it, because we're inherently curious creatures, constantly striving to understand ourselves better. As we observed this dynamic, we began to craft stories about the individuals who were successful at climbing the hierarchies. These became our heroes. That's where heroic myths originated. And the quintessential hero is the individual who ventures forth and slays the dragon. No surprise there, because that was clearly a significant accomplishment. Perhaps when we were still living in trees, that would have been the ultimate hero. The archetypal hero is the person who sets out, kills the dragon, retrieves the gold, brings it back to the community, and then shares it equitably. He's also the individual most likely to rise to the top of the hierarchy. He's the person most likely to find the virgin, because it's a virgin that you rescue from the dragon and then get to claim as your own. The hierarchy, then, is a mechanism that not only selects heroes, but also effectively breeds them. After observing that dynamic for 6 million years, we gradually begin to comprehend what it truly means to be a hero. We then proceed to tell stories about that concept. So not only are we genetically predisposed towards that behavior, with the hierarchy serving as a method of selecting males that is governed by female choice, but our narratives also actively encourage us in that direction. We declare, that person is admirable, and we proceed to tell a story about them. And we declare, this other person is admirable, and we then tell another story about them. Simultaneously, we discuss the individuals who are not admirable. We begin to categorize behavior as either admirable or non-admirable. From that, we derive something akin to good and evil. Then you can begin to conceive of the perfect individual, someone who is meta-admirable, someone who embodies all of the admirable qualities to the fullest extent. That becomes a hero, then a religious figure, and ultimately a savior or messiah. That's how we ultimately conceptualize the ideal person. In the West, this is how we've ultimately resolved it. We've concluded that the ideal person, the ideal man, is the individual who tells the truth. What that ultimately signifies is that that's the most effective way to climb any conceivable hierarchy in a manner that is both stable and enduring. That's the considered conclusion of Western culture, as far as I can ascertain. If you wish to maximize your chances of achieving both success and well-being, you should seek out a job where your intelligence would position you within the top quarter of performers. That's the sweet spot. You're a big fish in a relatively small pond. You certainly don't want to be the least intelligent person in the room. That's a difficult position to be in. But you probably don't want to be the most intelligent person in the room either, because that likely indicates that you should be in a different room altogether. You should ideally seek out a position where, if you find yourself right at the top, you've essentially mastered it. It's then time to move on to a situation where you're slightly lower down, so that you have something to strive for and work towards. If you're not particularly conscientious, for example, you probably wouldn't want a job that demands that you work 70 hours per week. You're simply not wired that way. You'd undoubtedly prefer to have some leisure time, and good on you if that's your natural inclination. There's absolutely nothing wrong with valuing your free time. However, if you're the sort of person who can't abide sitting around doing nothing, then perhaps you should pursue a career that will require you to work 75 hours per week. Almost all positions at the highest echelons of complex hierarchies require exceptionally high intelligence and extraordinarily high levels of conscientiousness, generally speaking, as well as a remarkably high tolerance for stress, because that can easily incapacitate you. You're likely to experience significant peaks and troughs in your career trajectory, generally speaking, at the more elevated levels of any structure. You'll be required to make highly complex decisions, often with a very limited amount of time to deliberate. You must carefully consider whether that's truly what you desire. If you genuinely aspire to be the very best at what you do, without any shadow of a doubt, then possessing an IQ above 145 is an absolute necessity, and in some cases, you might even need to be pushing 160. That might only apply to one person in 10,000, or even one person in 100,000. To truly excel, you'll probably need to be reasonably stress-tolerant and at least somewhat conscientious. When you ponder why it is that intelligent people tend to occupy the upper echelons of hierarchies, the answer, in part, is simply because they tend to arrive there first. Generally speaking, everything is essentially a race, and the faster you are, the more likely you are to be at the forefront. Intelligence, to a significant extent, is a measure of speed, although it's certainly not the only factor. If you're striving towards something challenging, the quicker individuals are invariably going to reach it first.